The moment you realize your worth isn't tied to someone else's validation is the moment you truly take control of your life. My husband's face turned ashen when I slid that leather portfolio across our antique oak dining table, right between the glazed ham and my grandmother's crystal gravy boat. 18 years of marriage, and he'd never once bothered to read page 4, section 12 of our prenuptial agreement. The section that quietly transferred ownership of our entire business empire to me the day he violated our fidelity clause. As his new girlfriend squeezed his hand reassuringly, clearly confused by the sudden tension in the room, I smiled for what felt like the first time in months. "Daniel," I said softly, "perhaps you'd like to explain to Vanessa why her new office will need to be cleared out by Monday morning? If you're watching this right now, I want you to know you're not alone." Betrayal comes in many forms, but it's how we respond that defines us. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, and if any part of this story touches a chord with you. Make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I'm sharing the exact steps I took to protect myself financially before I even suspected anything was wrong. Information I wish someone had given me years ago. Now, let's dive into how our Easter Sunday family tradition became the stage for the most strategic comeback of my life. The dining room in our Druid Hills home had always been my favorite space. Warm cherry wainscoting, tall windows that caught the afternoon sun, and enough space to comfortably seat our extended family for holiday gatherings. I'd spent 2 days preparing for this Easter celebration, selecting the wine Daniel preferred, coordinating with our favorite caterer for a heritage ham with all the traditional fixings, and ensuring every detail from the hand-pressed linens to my grandmother's heirloom serving pieces was perfect. 18 years of marriage deserved nothing less, even if the subtle distance growing between us had become increasingly difficult to ignore. The antique grandfather clock in the hall chimed 5 o'clock as I arranged the sterling silver flatware my mother had given us as a wedding present. Through the archway into the living room, I could see my children, Emily engrossed in her phone and Zach playing a video game, while my parents chatted with Jack and Olivia near the fireplace. Daniel had texted that he was running late, something about finalizing details for the Nashville location. What he hadn't mentioned was that he wouldn't be coming alone. I adjusted the arrangement of tulips and hydrangeas at the center of the table, noticing how the cut crystal vase caught the light from the chandelier overhead. These small details had always mattered to me, the careful touches that transformed a meal into an experience. Daniel used to tease me about my perfectionist tendencies before he began featuring them prominently in our Serenity Springs marketing materials. The Rebecca Mitchell touch, he called it in our company newsletter. That attention to detail that had become our brand's signature. The scent of caramelized sugar and cinnamon wafted from the kitchen as the caterer put the finishing touches on my mother's secret recipe apple tart. Our family tradition had always been to serve Easter dinner precisely at 5:30, but it was approaching 6, and Daniel had yet to arrive. Emily and Zach exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their father's increasing unreliability. My mother maintained her composed smile, though the slight furrow in her brow betrayed her concern. "Perhaps we should begin without him," my father finally suggested, his voice carrying that blend of diplomacy and authority that had served him well as a business consultant for 40 years. "Just 5 more minutes," I replied, maintaining my hostess smile. He texted that he's almost here. What I didn't share was the rest of his message. Bringing someone from work. Important announcement. After nearly 2 decades of marriage, I had developed a finely tuned sense for Daniel's surprises. This one had set off alarm bells the moment I'd read his text. The timing was too perfect, too closely aligned with what my business attorney had uncovered 3 weeks ago. Daniel had always had a flair for dramatic timing, but tonight's performance promised to be particularly memorable, though not in the way he anticipated. Through the beveled glass of our front door, I saw headlights sweep across the driveway as Daniel's Tesla pulled in. I took a deep breath and smoothed the front of my navy silk dress, a recent purchase that I knew complemented my auburn hair, and projected the image of confident control I needed tonight. Years in the spa industry had taught me the value of appearance as armor, a visual statement of intent and position. "They're here," I announced quietly, just as the front door opened. Daniel's voice carried from the entryway, followed by a lighter, female laugh that seemed to cut through the familiar sounds of our home like an intrusive note in a well-practiced melody. Daniel guided his companion into the dining room, with his hand placed possessively at the small of her back. Vanessa Reynolds, our 29-year-old marketing director, wore a pale pink dress that highlighted her figure and made her look even younger than she was. The room fell silent as every head turned toward the doorway, the collective intake of breath almost audible in the sudden stillness. Daniel's smile never wavered as he surveyed the room. At 45, he still cut an impressive figure, tall and fit, with just enough silver at his temples to look distinguished rather than aged. The casual confidence in his stance spoke of a man accustomed to controlling the narrative in any room he entered. "Sorry we're late," he announced, his voice carrying that familiar authoritative tone he'd perfected in company-wide meetings. Traffic was brutal coming back from the office, but we're here now, and I have someone very special I'd like you all to meet. My mother's knuckles whitened around her linen napkin. Emily and Zach exchanged identical looks of dawning comprehension. Jack studied his water glass with sudden intense interest, while Olivia's eyes darted between Daniel and me, measuring, calculating, preparing for the fallout. "Everyone," Daniel continued, either missing or ignoring the tension that had transformed. "The room? This is Vanessa Reynolds, our brilliant marketing director who's been helping us prepare for the Nashville expansion. She's recently become much more than a colleague to me, and we have some wonderful news to share tonight." Vanessa offered a tentative smile, her hand unconsciously moving to rest on her stomach, a gesture so instinctively feminine, so fundamentally declarative that no verbal announcement was necessary. The statement had been made in that simple touch, the evidence of my husband's betrayal displayed for all to see. "As you can probably tell," Daniel said with a smile that didn't quite reach. His eyes, "Vanessa and I are expecting a child in September. I know this comes as a surprise, but sometimes life takes unexpected turns, and I'm embracing this new chapter." The subtle glance toward our children wasn't lost on anyone, the unspoken suggestion that this new family wouldn't diminish his commitment to them somehow making the betrayal even more complete. I rose from my seat with practiced grace, years of hosting client events and charity galas finally serving their ultimate purpose. The weight of the moment might have crushed a woman less prepared, but I had been anticipating this confrontation since receiving the first report from my attorney showing unusual transfers from our business accounts to a newly established LLC. "Vanessa," I said, extending my hand, "how lovely to finally meet you properly. Please, come sit beside me. You must be exhausted in your condition." I gestured to the chair traditionally reserved for honored guests. The look of confusion that flashed across Daniel's face was just the first note in the symphony of revelations I had orchestrated for this evening. He had clearly expected tears, accusations, perhaps a scene. The kind of emotional outburst that he could later characterize as irrational, that he could use to justify his actions to family, friends, and business associates. What he had never understood about me, despite 18 years of marriage, was that I had learned long ago to transform emotion into strategy. As I guided Vanessa to the seat beside mine, I caught my mother's eye. The slight nod she offered might have been imperceptible to others, but to me it was confirmation. The retired attorney who had insisted on the comprehensive prenuptial agreement all those years ago, over my lovesick objections, had declared her position in the battle about to unfold. "Daniel," I said calmly, "why don't you sit across from us? I believe we have much to discuss over dinner." I signaled to the caterer hovering discreetly in the doorway. "Please serve the first course and bring Mr. Mitchell his bourbon, the Blantons. I believe that's still your preference?" As Daniel took his seat, momentarily displaced by my unexpected composure, I reached for my handbag an elegant leather piece that had been a gift from my parents on our 15th anniversary. From its interior, I withdrew a slim leather portfolio, embossed with the Serenity Springs logo in gold leaf. "Before we begin," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the tension-filled room, "perhaps we should discuss the future you envision for Serenity Springs, Daniel. After all, with a new child on the way, I imagine you have grand plans for the legacy you intend to leave." What Daniel didn't realize as he reached for his bourbon with a smirk beginning to form on his lips was that I had spent the last 3 weeks preparing for this moment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Every late night he thought I was reviewing spa renovation plans or organizing marketing campaigns. I had actually been meeting with attorneys and financial advisors, experts who helped me understand exactly what our prenuptial agreement entitled me to in this precise scenario. The stage was set, the players were in position, and as our family's traditional Easter dinner began, none of them, not even Daniel, could anticipate how completely the future of Serenity Springs was about to be transformed. If you're still with me on this journey, I want to take a moment to connect with all of you watching. Chances are you've either experienced betrayal yourself or know someone who has. That feeling of having everything you believed in suddenly questioned creates a wound unlike any other. I'm sharing my story today not just for myself, but because I believe there's power in knowing you're not alone. The isolation that follows betrayal can be almost as devastating as the betrayal itself. So tell me in the comments where you're watching from and if any part of this story resonates with your own experience. Your story matters too. While you're at it, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow I'm releasing a special follow-up video about the legal frameworks that protected me and how you can safeguard your own interests in any relationship. Now, let's return to that tense Easter dinner table where much more than a holiday meal was about to be served. The first course, a chilled carrot and ginger soup garnished with micro herbs, arrived with impeccable timing, momentarily shifting attention from the dramatic situation unfolding around us. Emily and Zach, both remarkably composed considering the circumstances, maintained carefully neutral expressions. I'd raised them to be resilient and observant, qualities that served them well in this moment of family crisis. Daniel cleared his throat, clearly thrown off balance by my calm demeanor. He'd expected a scene, tears perhaps, or at minimum cold anger. My cordial welcome to Vanessa had disrupted his script before he'd even begun his performance. "Rebecca," he started, using my full name as he always did when attempting to establish authority. "I realize this comes as a shock, but I hoped we could all be adults about the situation. Things between us haven't been the same for quite some time." I smiled slightly, taking a deliberate sip of the Sancerre I'd selected to accompany the first course. "Nothing shocks me anymore, Daniel, especially not after reviewing the quarterly transfers to Sunrise Properties LLC last month." His brow furrowed slightly, the first crack in his facade. The real estate holding company he had established 6 months ago, supposedly for the Nashville expansion, was something he believed only he and our accountant knew about. He didn't realize that as co-founder and executive vice president, I received copies of all significant financial transactions. "The Nashville property is progressing well," he responded with practiced smoothness. "Some initial paperwork delays, but Vanessa's community outreach has positioned us perfectly for the fall opening." Vanessa straightened at the mention of her professional contribution, clearly eager to steer the conversation toward safer territory. "We've secured partnerships with 3 of the top luxury hotels in the area," she offered. "The projected bookings for the holiday season are extremely promising." "How fascinating," I replied, turning my attention fully to her. "You must be very proud of your work there. Serenity Springs has always valued innovative thinking. It's the foundation of our success." "Our success," Daniel emphasized, reaching for his bourbon. 18 years of building on my family's wellness philosophy. When my children take over someday, they'll have quite the empire to inherit." My mother's spoon clinked sharply against her soup bowl, the closest thing to an outburst the dignified former attorney would permit herself in company. Her eyes met mine briefly, and I recognized the subtle signal we'd established decades ago. She was ready to follow my lead, wherever this evening might go. "Speaking of legacies," Jack interjected, his voice carrying that slightly hesitant quality it had held since childhood when standing up to his older brother. "Perhaps this isn't the most appropriate setting for such announcements, Daniel. The kids are practically adults now," Daniel dismissed, barely glancing at Emily and Zach. "And they should understand how the real world works. Marriages evolve, partnerships change, and families adapt accordingly." "Arrangements," I noted. "How telling that you would reduce 18 years of marriage to an arrangement that has simply run its course." I watched Emily's fingers tighten around her water glass, her high school ethics education clearly at odds with her father's cavalier attitude. "And what sort of arrangement do you envision going forward, Daniel?" I asked, my voice carrying just enough warmth to confuse him. This wasn't the confrontation he'd prepared for. He leaned back, relaxing marginally as he assumed we were moving into negotiation territory, his comfort zone. "I've had Gary draw up some papers, very generous terms considering the circumstances. You'll keep this house, of course, and receive a reasonable annual income. I imagine you'll want to step back from day-to-day operations, but perhaps we can find you something suitable with our charitable foundation." The sheer audacity of his presumption was almost admirable. In his mind, he'd already resolved everything, divested himself of an aging wife, secured a younger replacement who carried his child, and neatly relegated me to a powerless position, while he maintained complete control of the empire we'd built together. "How thoughtful," I murmured, signaling to the caterer to clear the first course. "Though I'm curious about Mr. Davis's involvement, considering he's not actually Serenity Springs' legal counsel of record." Another flicker of confusion crossed Daniel's face. "Gary has handled all my legal affairs for the past 5 years." "Your personal legal affairs, perhaps," I corrected gently, "but not the corporate structure. Patty Chen still maintains that responsibility, as stipulated in our original incorporation documents." My father shifted uncomfortably, aware that the conversation had moved into territory he'd always deliberately avoided. The operation of the family business had been Daniel's domain since its expansion beyond our first location, with my parents content to enjoy the benefits as early investors without shouldering the responsibilities. "Patty is occupied with the Charleston permits," Daniel dismissed, though I caught the slight narrowing of his eyes. "Gary has been handling day-to-day operations for years." "For some operations," I agreed pleasantly as the main course arrived. Glazed ham, scalloped potatoes, and fresh asparagus with hollandaise sauce. Though not, interestingly, for the trust administration or the holding company structure. Daniel set down his bourbon glass a bit too forcefully, causing the crystal to sing a high, tense note. "I wasn't aware you had such interest in corporate structures, Rebecca. You've always been more focused on the customer experience and design aspects of our properties." "A woman contains multitudes, Daniel," I replied, nodding appreciation, to the server who placed a perfect portion of ham on my plate. "And 18 years is a long time to observe and learn." Vanessa glanced between us, clearly sensing the undercurrents but unable to decipher their meaning. Her hand moved protectively to her stomach in an unconscious gesture that might have wounded me under different circumstances. Now I felt only a distant pity for her. She was merely a pawn in a game whose rules she didn't understand, a game that had begun long before she entered the picture. "If we could return to more pleasant conversation," my mother suggested, her voice carrying the authority that had guided our family through decades of both public triumph and private turmoil. "Emily, tell us about your college applications. Harvard was impressed with your volunteer work, I believe?" It was a masterful redirect, giving everyone at the table an opportunity to retreat from the precipice we'd been approaching. Emily, seized the opening with the social grace she'd inherited from both her grandmother and me, launching into an animated description of her campus visit that required no real engagement from anyone listening. I caught my mother's eye and offered a slight nod of appreciation. She understood the value of timing as well as I did. The revelations I had planned would unfold according to my carefully orchestrated schedule, not in response to Daniel's provocations. As the conversation shifted to safer topics, I watched Daniel visibly relax, mistaking the temporary reprieve for surrender. He turned his attention to Vanessa, his hand occasionally resting possessively on her arm as he guided her through the intricacies of family dynamics, introducing anecdotes and context designed to establish his central importance to every aspect of family history and business success. What he didn't realize, what he had never fully appreciated, was that for 18 years, I had been the silent architect of that success. Behind every major expansion, every successful renovation, every innovative service concept that had become the Serenity Springs signature, my influence had shaped outcomes while Daniel took center stage and claimed the credit. The staff began preparing for dessert service, individual lemon soufflés with lavender-infused cream, a tradition I'd introduced our first Easter as a married couple. I checked my watch discreetly, counting down to the moment when the first domino would fall in the sequence I'd arranged so carefully over the past 3 weeks. In exactly 12 minutes, as the soufflés were being served, Daniel's phone would ring with a call he couldn't ignore. The first note in the symphony of revelations that would reshape not just our family dinner, but the entire future of Serenity Springs. As the dining room was prepared for dessert, I observed how Daniel leaned in closer to Vanessa, his voice dropping to that intimate register he'd once reserved for me in the early years of our marriage. He was explaining some apparently amusing anecdote about the original acquisition of our flagship Atlanta location, gesturing expansively as he described his visionary decision to purchase the struggling day spa and transform it into the cornerstone of the Serenity Springs brand. The previous owners had no concept of luxury positioning, he told her, his hand now resting casually on her lower back. They were running it like a strip mall nail salon. I saw the potential immediately. The space was perfect for something truly exceptional. What he conveniently omitted was that I had been the one to identify the property, research its potential, and create the entire repositioning strategy. I had spent weeks interviewing designers, therapists, and hospitality consultants to craft the vision that would become the Serenity Springs signature experience. Daniel had merely signed the papers and accepted the accolades when the revitalized location became the most sought-after spa reservation in Atlanta. This pattern of appropriation had become so familiar over the years that I had stopped correcting him, both publicly and privately. His narrative of singular genius had become the accepted history, not just with the press and our social circle, but eventually within the family itself. Even the kids had grown up absorbing the mythology of their father's business acumen, though they'd occasionally glimpsed enough of my behind-the-scenes work to question the official version. The Nashville property is actually following Mom's design concept, isn't it, Dad? Zach asked, his voice carrying that deceptively innocent tone he'd perfected since childhood when asking questions he already knew the answers to. I remember Mom flying to California to meet with that famous architect. What was his name? Jensen, I supplied quietly. Christopher Jensen. Daniel waved a dismissive hand. Rebecca handled some of the aesthetic details, of course, but the vision and execution were mine. He turned to Vanessa with a conspiratorial smile. My wife has always had an eye for decoration, though sometimes her ideas need to be reined in for practical considerations. Decoration, 18 years of architectural innovation, brand development, and strategic positioning reduced to decoration. I met my mother's gaze across the table and saw the flash of indignation she quickly masked. She, more than anyone, knew the truth of my contributions to Serenity Springs. Jensen won the Pritzker Prize last year, didn't he? My father asked. his voice carrying an unusual edge. Quite a coup to have him design the Nashville property. Yes, he did, Vanessa confirmed eagerly, seemingly relieved to contribute to the conversation in her professional capacity. His design for Serenity Springs, Nashville has been featured in Architectural Digest and Spa and Wellness Quarterly. It's become a case study at several design schools. Thanks largely to your marketing efforts, I'm sure, Daniel said, patting her hand affectionately. The gesture was calculated to remind everyone at the table of their relationship, while simultaneously dismissing the significance of the architectural achievement. I observed the fleeting shadow that crossed Vanessa's face, the first indication that perhaps she wasn't entirely comfortable with her role in this drama. She was young, ambitious, and clearly talented at her job. Under different circumstances, I might have mentored her, guided her career within the Serenity Springs organization. Now she was carrying my husband's child and being unwittingly positioned as my replacement, both personally and professionally. The Jensen design was revolutionary for the brand, I noted, keeping my tone conversational. It established the architectural signature that's now being implemented across all the new properties. I turned to Vanessa. I imagine that gives you a strong foundation for the regional marketing strategy. Before she could respond, Daniel's phone chimed with a notification. He glanced down, frowning slightly as he read the message. "Excuse me," he said, rising from his chair. "I need to take this. Won't be a moment." As he stepped away from the table to make his call near the French doors leading to the garden, I noted the exact time on the elegant watch my parents had given me for my 40th birthday. Right on schedule, the first piece of my carefully orchestrated plan was sliding into place. "Vanessa," I said, turning my full attention to the young woman who now sat awkwardly beside me, suddenly deprived of Daniel's protective presence. "Tell me about yourself. Daniel has been surprisingly reticent about your background." Her discomfort was palpable as she glanced toward Daniel, who was now engaged in what appeared to be an increasingly tense phone conversation. "There's not much to tell, really," she offered. "I grew up in Charlotte, studied marketing at Emory, and joined Serenity Springs 2 years ago to help launch the expansion. Emory is an excellent school," I remarked. "I'm an alumna myself, class of 2005. Her eyes widened slightly. "I didn't realize. Daniel never mentioned you were marketing educated." "There are many things Daniel has chosen not to mention over the years," I replied with a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. "Tell me, when did you first become involved with the Nashville property development?" "About 14 months ago," she answered, her professional confidence returning as we moved into familiar territory. I was initially brought in to develop the pre-opening marketing strategy, but my role expanded as the project progressed. 14 months. The timeline aligned perfectly with what my attorney had uncovered. Their affair had begun shortly. After Vanessa was assigned to work directly with Daniel on the Nashville launch, a textbook case of workplace power dynamics exploited by a man who should have known better. "And your relationship with Daniel?" I asked, my voice dropping just enough to make the question feel intimate rather than accusatory. Vanessa glanced, again toward Daniel, who remained engrossed in his increasingly animated phone conversation. "It evolved naturally through our work together," she offered cautiously. "I never intended, that is, I didn't know he was planning to bring you to Easter dinner and announce your pregnancy to his family?" I supplied when she faltered. "Yes? That would be rather consistent with Daniel's approach to significant life changes. He's always preferred dramatic gestures over thoughtful conversations." Across the table, Emily made a sound that might have been a stifled laugh. My daughter had witnessed enough of her father's grand pronouncements over the years to recognize the pattern. "I want you to know," Vanessa said, lowering her voice further, "I never meant to cause pain. When things started between us, Daniel told me the marriage was already over in all but name. He said you had an understanding. The familiar lie of unfaithful husbands throughout history. I wondered briefly how many other women had heard the same explanation over the years. Daniel's infidelities hadn't been frequent, but neither was this the first time. An understanding, I repeated softly. How convenient that must have been for him. Vanessa flushed, her hand moving again to her stomach in that protective gesture that spoke volumes. I wouldn't have become involved if I'd known that he was lying, I suggested gently, or that he would put you in this impossible position. I gestured around the table, pregnant and facing his family across the Easter dinner table before any divorce was even discussed. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, and I felt an unexpected surge of compassion. Vanessa was not the villain. In this story, merely another woman who had fallen for Daniel's practiced charm and calculated attention. The real betrayal lay not in his infidelity, but in the decades of dismissal, appropriation, and disrespect that had preceded it. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and the genuine regret in her voice only strengthened my resolve to proceed with my plan. This young woman and her unborn child were, in many ways, just as much Daniel's victims as I had been, drawn into his orbit with promises and flattery, only to be used as props in his carefully constructed narrative of success. At the French doors, Daniel's voice rose enough for us to catch fragments of his conversation. Impossible. Must be a mistake. Check again. His normally confident posture had stiffened, tension visible in the set of his shoulders. My mother cleared her throat delicately. "Perhaps this would be a good time to serve dessert," she suggested, her years as a corporate attorney having taught her the value of maintaining normal routines in the midst of crises. The caterer responded immediately, bringing in the individual, lemon soufflés with their accompanying lavender cream. The presentation was exquisite, each golden dome rising perfectly above its ramekin, dusted with powdered sugar and garnished with a crystallized violet. "These look wonderful," Jack commented, seizing the opportunity to move conversation to safer ground. "Rebecca, your attention to detail with the menu is always impeccable." "Thank you, Jack," I replied, accepting the compliment with a nod. I believe traditions are worth maintaining, even in challenging circumstances. As we began the dessert course, Daniel returned to the table, his expression now visibly troubled. He slid his phone into his pocket and resumed his seat without comment, though his earlier bravado had dimmed considerably. "Is everything all right?" Vanessa asked, her concern evident. "Fine," he replied. Curtly, "Just a small issue with the Charleston property that needs attention." I took a deliberate bite of my soufflé, savoring both the delicate lemon sweetness and the knowledge that the small issue was actually the first tremor in what would soon become a seismic shift in Daniel's carefully constructed world. The TC call had come from our bank, questioning certain discrepancies in the property's financing documentation. Discrepancies I had strategically highlighted through an anonymous tip 3 days ago. "Charleston has been performing exceptionally well this quarter," I noted casually, especially considering the zoning challenges in that market. Daniel's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as he studied my face. For perhaps the first time, that evening, he was truly seeing me, not as the decorative wife he'd outgrown, but as someone who might possess information he didn't control. "The zoning environment is complex," he replied cautiously, "but nothing we haven't navigated successfully before." "Of course," I agreed, meeting his gaze steadily, though I've always found that transparency is the best approach with financial institutions. Wouldn't you agree? The double meaning wasn't lost on him. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face as he considered, perhaps for the first time, whether I might know about the offshore accounts, the tax structures, the carefully disguised fund movements that had characterized his management of Serenity Springs Expansion Capital. "Most business matters are too nuanced for simple transparency," he countered, reaching for his water glass rather than the bourbon. "Context and complexity require sophisticated handling." "Indeed they do," I agreed pleasantly. which is why I've always appreciated Patty Chen's thorough approach to documentation. Old school, perhaps, but remarkably effective for preserving what matters. The mention of our corporate attorney again seemed to unsettle him. Daniel had systematically distanced himself from our original legal team after our third location opened, bringing in his own people, establishing his own systems. What he didn't know, what he had never bothered to confirm, was exactly what authorities those original corporate documents had preserved. Dessert continued in tense silence, the earlier flow of conversation now dammed by the undercurrents of Daniel's phone call and my cryptic comments. The twins exchanged glances, sensing the shift in atmosphere but unable to decipher its meaning. Jack studied his soufflé with unnecessary concentration, while Olivia watched the dynamics with the keen observation of someone who had married into the family rather than being born to its complications. Only my mother seemed truly at ease, enjoying her dessert with the serene composure of someone who had witnessed decades of legal drama and knew that resolution, however painful, always eventually came. As the caterer cleared the dessert plates, Daniel cleared his throat. "I think it's time we discuss the practical aspects of the situation," he announced, attempting to reclaim control of the narrative. "Rebecca and I will be divorcing, and Vanessa and I will be married before the baby arrives in September. I've already begun transitioning Rebecca's responsibilities within the organization to ensure minimal disruption." The presumption was breathtaking, that he had the authority to unilaterally remove me from the company, that he could simply announce life-altering decisions as if they were foregone conclusions, that everyone at the table would simply accept his pronouncements without question. 18 years ago, they might have. 18 years ago, I might have as well. But that was before I discovered exactly what our prenuptial agreement had stipulated, and exactly what had legally constituted grounds for its most severe provisions to take effect. Daniel leaned back in his chair, swirling the remains of his bourbon with the practiced nonchalance of a man accustomed to having the final word. "I've instructed Gary to prepare a comprehensive settlement package," he announced, his tone suggesting he was bestowing a great generosity rather than fulfilling a legal obligation. "Given your contributions as my wife, Rebecca, I think you'll find the terms more than fair." The calculated emphasis on my wife versus any acknowledgement of my professional role spoke volumes. In Daniel's worldview, I had been an accessory to his success, decorative, occasionally useful, but ultimately replaceable, a sentiment he was now making painfully explicit. "As I mentioned," he continued, setting down his glass and steepling his fingers in that gesture I'd seen countless times in board meeting presentations, "you'll retain this house. I know how much you enjoy your garden here, and it seems a fitting venue for your retirement." Retirement at 42. As though my career, my expertise, my vision had all been some charming hobby to keep me occupied, until I gracefully exited the stage at his convenience. "How considerate," I murmured, reaching for my water glass. "And what arrangements have you made for my equity in the company?" Something flickered across his face, annoyance perhaps at my failure to simply express gratitude for his magnanimity. "You'll receive a generous annual stipend drawn from the family trust," he replied smoothly, "structured as consultancy fees for tax purposes, naturally." "Naturally," I echoed, maintaining my composed exterior while noting how thoroughly he had convinced himself that the empire we'd built together was his alone to allocate. "And the board has approved this restructuring?" Daniel waved a dismissive hand. "The board serves at my discretion, Rebecca. They'll ratify whatever decisions I deem appropriate for the company's future." Across the table, Jack winced slightly at his brother's naked display of autocratic thinking. Even he, who had deliberately remained disengaged from the family business operations, recognized the arrogance in Daniel's proclamation. "Dad," Emily interjected, her voice carrying the precision of someone choosing her words with extreme care. "I thought the incorporation documents included specific provisions about board independence after the expansion beyond 3 locations?" I suppressed a smile at my daughter's strategic intervention. Her business ethics professor at her private school would have been proud of both her recall and her timing. Daniel's expression hardened momentarily before he manufactured an indulgent smile. Your corporate governance textbooks provide excellent theoretical frameworks, sweetheart, but the practical reality of family businesses operates differently. The board understands their role is advisory, not directorial. Fascinating interpretation, I commented lightly. I wonder what Judge Watkins would make of that perspective. The mention of the famously stern business court judge who had ruled against several high-profile CEOs in recent governance disputes caused Daniel's smile to falter slightly. Legal technicalities aside, he continued, redirecting the conversation, I've ensured everyone will be well provided for through this transition, including you, Rebecca. How reassuring, I replied. Though I'm curious about your plans for the Charleston expansion. Will you be proceeding with the wellness retreat concept? The question was deliberately crafted to sound innocent while probing a sensitive issue. The luxury wellness retreat I'd been developing for the past year represented my most ambitious project yet, and one Daniel had consistently opposed as too expensive and too complex. The Charleston property is being reassessed, he answered, carefully. The current market conditions suggest we may need to postpone major capital investments. What market conditions? Vanessa asked, professional interest momentarily overriding her discomfort. The luxury wellness sector is projected to grow by 12% next year. All our market research indicates the timing is optimal for expansion. I watched with quiet satisfaction as Daniel struggled to navigate this unexpected challenge from his pregnant girlfriend. He hadn't anticipated that her professional expertise might complicate his narrative. There are broader strategic considerations, beyond market projections, he responded, his tone carrying that patronizing quality he adopted when his judgment was questioned. The board and I are evaluating our global footprint with a focus on maximizing returns across the entire portfolio. The board? I repeated thoughtfully. Including Patty Chena's counsel, or just Gary Davis? Daniel's jaw tightened almost, imperceptibly. Corporate structure discussions aren't appropriate for the Easter dinner table, Rebecca. Perhaps we should return to more festive topics. On the contrary, my mother interjected with regal composure. I find corporate governance absolutely fascinating, particularly when it concerns the family legacy I helped finance at its inception. The subtle rebuke in her words was unmistakable. Margaret Wilson had never directly challenged Daniel's management of Serenity Springs since investing her retirement funds to help us open our second location, maintaining the traditional separation between family and business that had characterized her approach as an attorney. Her intervention now signaled a significant shift, one that clearly took Daniel by surprise. Maggie, he began, his tone hovering between deference and impatience. The business landscape has evolved considerably since those early days. The structures and strategies that served the company then would be hopelessly outdated now. Evolution is inevitable. My mother agreed with a slight incline of her head. Though I've always believed that principles should remain constant even as practices adapt to changing circumstances. My colleagues and I were particularly adamant about maintaining core governance, values in the companies we represented. Daniel's expression tightened further. He had never appreciated being reminded of my mother's legal expertise, particularly when it conflicted with his own more expedient approach to business. Serenity Springs' success under my leadership speaks for itself, he stated flatly. 5 new properties, market valuation quadrupled, brand recognition expanded to 3 regions. I think the results validate my methods. Results without integrity are merely numbers on a balance sheet, my mother replied, her voice soft but unyielding. But then, you always did prefer quantifiable metrics to qualitative values. An uncomfortable silence settled over the table. In all the years of family gatherings, I had never witnessed my mother so directly challenge Daniel's perspective. He appeared momentarily at a loss, unused to having his authority questioned by my mother. Vanessa shifted awkwardly beside me, clearly unnerved by the undercurrents she couldn't fully decipher. The twins exchanged another of their silent communications. Raised eyebrow from Emily met with a slight nod from Zach. They sensed the power dynamic shifting but couldn't yet see the pattern those shifts were forming. Daniel recovered quickly, his momentary discomfort masked beneath a veneer of magnanimous tolerance. "Different generations naturally have different priorities," he said smoothly. "Rebecca and I built something remarkable from one struggling spa. My contribution has been to modernize and expand that foundation, and my new child will inherit a wellness empire ready for the next evolution." The presumption in his words hung in the air, the automatic assumption that his unborn child with Vanessa would eventually control Serenity Springs, regardless of the existence of his two highly capable children with me or any other consideration. "Fascinating how you've planned the next 30 years of corporate succession based on a child who hasn't even been born," I observed, particularly given the financial challenges emerging in Charleston. His eyes narrowed at my second reference to the Charleston situation. "A minor administrative issue that will be resolved by morning," he dismissed, though the slight tension in his shoulders betrayed his concern. "Of course," I agreed pleasantly, though in my experience, banking institutions rarely make inquiries without substantial cause, particularly regarding property financing structures. For the first time that evening, genuine alarm flashed across Daniel's face before he could suppress it. "Your experience with banking compliance is somewhat limited, Rebecca," he countered, his tone deliberately condescending. "These matters require specialized expertise." "How fortunate, then, that I've had the benefit of excellent advisors," I replied, maintaining eye contact as I reached for my handbag, "including Benjamin Edwards at Southern Trust Bank, who sends his regards, by the way. We had quite an illuminating meeting last week." Daniel stilled completely, his bourbon glass halfway to his lips. "You met with Edwards? Why?" The question emerged sharper than he'd intended, the first real crack in his composed facade. Ben Edwards had been our primary banking relationship manager for the past decade, a connection Daniel had cultivated carefully and considered his exclusive domain. That I had met with him privately clearly registered as a boundary crossing Daniel hadn't anticipated. "Professional curiosity," I answered lightly. "It's remarkable how much institutional knowledge resides with long-term financial partners." Ben was particularly helpful in explaining the nuances of the cross-collateralization agreements and their implications for our consolidated debt structure. The color drained from Daniel's face so rapidly that even Vanessa noticed, her brow furrowing with concern as she placed a hand on his arm. "Daniel, are you all right?" He ignored her, his attention fixed entirely on me. "The cross-collateralization is a standard financing structure," he stated, his voice tightly controlled. "Its practical application ensures optimal capital efficiency across all properties." "That's where things get interesting," I replied, removing a slim leather folder from my handbag. According to the original loan documentation, which Ben helpfully provided, any modification affecting the primary collateral requires unanimous consent from all registered guarantors. "Which was obtained," Daniel snapped, his patience visibly fraying. "The loan committee minutes reflect your presentation of a modification plan," I interrupted gently, "and a vote approving implementation subject to all necessary consents being secured. But there's no record of those consents ever being properly documented." I paused, allowing the implication to sink in. "Specifically, my consent as the co-guarantor of the primary Atlanta property loan since our fourth expansion phase." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the caterer moving discreetly around the perimeter of the dining room seemed to freeze at the bombshell I had just detonated. "That's impossible," Daniel finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. The refinancing was completed last year. The documents were all executed. Almost correct, I acknowledged. The primary loan documents were indeed executed, but the guarantor consent forms for the cross-collateralization were never completed. My signature on those forms is quite clearly forged, as the handwriting analysis I commissioned last week confirms beyond any reasonable doubt. I opened the portfolio and removed a single document, sliding it across the table toward him. The expert's report makes for rather illuminating reading, particularly Section 3 regarding the consistent pressure pattern discrepancies. Daniel stared at the document as though it might burst into flames. His hand, when he finally reached for it, trembled almost imperceptibly, the first visible manifestation of genuine fear I had seen from him in our 18 years together. As he unfolded the forensic document examiner's report, I watched the realization dawn across his face, dismantling 2 decades of unearned confidence, piece by devastating piece. The antique crystal decanter on the sideboard caught the light as my father moved past, sending prismatic reflections dancing across the hand-painted walls I had personally selected. I had chosen that pale sage color against Daniel's objections. He had favored something more conventional, something that wouldn't challenge guests' expectations of traditional decor. People don't want avant-garde in a family home, he'd argued at the time. They want recognizable comfort. But I had persisted, knowing that true style wasn't about predictability, but about distinctive, curated experiences that reflected authentic personality. The sage walls had since been featured in Southern Living magazine and become something of a signature for our home, unique, elegant, and subtly subversive of traditional expectations. How fitting that this backdrop of my creative vision against Daniel's resistance now framed his moment of reckoning as he read the forensic report. The color gradually returned to his face, not the healthy flush of relief, but the ruddy hue of mounting anger. His fingers tightened on the heavy paper, crinkling the edges of what had remained pristine for weeks in my personal files. "This report is deeply flawed," he finally declared, slapping the document down on the table. "No competent court would accept such speculative analysis based on a handful of signature samples." I smiled slightly, having anticipated this exact reaction. The original report is in Benjamin Edwards' possession, along with copies of all the relevant loan documents, and a formal affidavit regarding my lack of knowledge or consent to the cross-collateralization. The bank's compliance department has already flagged the matter for full review. The twins watched this exchange with identical expressions of fascinated calculation. They had grown up observing their father's business maneuvering, his strategic aggression masked as business acumen. Now they were witnessing something altogether different, their mother's long game finally revealed. "Even if this document were legitimate," Daniel continued, his voice tight with controlled fury, "the subsequent loan syndication would have superseded any original consent requirements. The participating banks accepted the documentation as presented." "That's an interesting legal theory," I replied mildly, though not one supported by Georgia banking regulations, as Ben has extensively documented. Any attempt to collateralize an asset without explicit written consent from all guarantors constitutes a material misrepresentation to the syndicated lenders. Section 34-17 of the State Code is quite specific on this point. Daniel's jaw worked as he processed this information. The loan syndication had been his masterpiece, a complex refinancing that had consolidated our property debt while theoretically maintaining each location as an independent asset. He had presented it to me as a modernization necessary for expansion, a streamlining of our financial structure. What he hadn't realized, what his new counsel, Gary Davis, had either missed or deliberately obscured, was that the original loan documents included tripwire protections specifically designed to prevent exactly this type of financial consolidation, without the knowledge and consent of all key stakeholders. The bank approved the refinancing unanimously, he insisted, though uncertainty had crept into his voice. The bank approved a proposal whose legal validity was contingent on securing all necessary consents, I corrected. A contingency that was never fulfilled because I never provided my consent as the co-guarantor. Vanessa glanced between us, clearly struggling to follow the technical aspects of the conversation, but sensing the fundamental power shift occurring. Her hand moved protectively to her stomach again, a gesture that now seemed less about the unborn child and more about her own suddenly precarious position. My mother, meanwhile, was watching the scene unfold with an expression I had rarely witnessed on her composed features: satisfaction. She reached for her wine glass, the substantial emerald-cut diamond on her right hand, her own mother's ring, catching the light as she did so. That ring symbolized the matriarchal power that had always operated beneath the surface of our family's apparent patriarchy, a power I had studied and learned from over 20 years as her daughter. "This is financial terrorism," Daniel declared, abandoning any pretense of calm. "You've been plotting this coup behind my back while pretending to support my vision for the company." I noted with detached interest how quickly he pivoted to portraying himself as the victim, a tactic he had employed whenever challenged throughout our marriage. The psychological architecture of his self-image required him to be both brilliant and betrayed, rather than simply wrong. "On the contrary," I replied, maintaining my composure, "I've been actively supporting and often creating the vision for Serenity Springs all these years. The only fiction was allowing you to believe you were the sole architect of that vision." Jack cleared his throat, drawing surprised attention from everyone at the table. My brother-in-law rarely inserted himself into confrontations, particularly those involving the business. "The redesign of the Miami property," he said quietly. "That was your concept, wasn't it, Rebecca? The incorporation of the coastal elements with sustainable luxury?" Daniel always claimed credit, but I remember you showing Mother the preliminary designs before Daniel announced the project. My mother nodded, a small but significant gesture of confirmation. "The partnership with Healing Hands Charity too," Emily added, her analytical mind clearly reassessing years of family lore through this new lens. "Dad said it was his initiative, but it was during Mom's wellness retreat research. I remember because you brought us back those handcrafted aromatherapy sets from the Women's Cooperative. One by one, the pivotal moments in Serenity Springs' ascendancy were being reattributed from Daniel to me. Each success that had built his reputation as a visionary wellness entrepreneur revealed as my creation." Daniel's hand clenched around, his water glass, his knuckles whitening with pressure. "This is absurd," he finally managed, his voice hoarse with suppressed rage. "A few design suggestions don't constitute corporate leadership. I made the decisions that built this company into what it is today. I took the risks. I secured the financing. I navigated the regulatory challenges. With my guidance," I pointed out gently. "Who prepared the briefing documents before every board meeting? Who reviewed the financial projections? Who identified the critical issues requiring attention and crafted the presentations that framed those issues favorably?" For 18 years, I had operated as the shadow CEO of Serenity Springs, researching, analyzing, strategizing, and then packaging my conclusions in ways that allowed Daniel to present them as his own insights. I had been the architect, and he had been the frontman, though neither of us had explicitly acknowledged this arrangement. "Administrative support isn't the same as executive function," Daniel dismissed, though the uncertainty in his tone betrayed his recognition of the oversimplification. "Is that what you call it when I restructured the vendor relationships during the pandemic?" I asked, my voice still calm despite the escalating tension. "When I negotiated the licensing agreement with Essential Botanicals that gave us exclusive access to their organic product line? When I identified the regulatory pathway for the Charleston property that saved 9 months of delays and hundreds of thousands in consulting fees?" Each example landed like a precision strike, dismantling Daniel's self-mythology piece by piece. The family watched in stunned silence as the corporate history they thought they knew was systematically revised before their eyes. Outside the dining room windows, the sunset cast a golden glow across our landscaped garden. Much like it had 18 years ago on our wedding day, when Daniel had brought me to our first tiny spa location and promised me we would build something extraordinary together. In a way, we had delivered on that promise, though neither of us had understood the full implications at the time. The caterer began preparing for coffee service, the silver pot and delicate porcelain cups, another tradition I'd established for family gatherings, a moment when tensions typically gave way to more relaxed conversation. Tonight, that tradition would serve a different purpose. "Coffee, Mr. Mitchell?" the caterer inquired, maintaining professional detachment despite the obvious tension at the table. Daniel waved him away impatiently. "This discussion isn't finished," he insisted, turning back to me. "Whatever documents you've unearthed, whatever technicalities you think you've discovered, the practical reality remains unchanged. I am the public face of Serenity Springs. I have the relationships with investors, with partners, with governmental authorities. The company cannot function without me." His declaration hung in the air, the last desperate assertion of indispensability, from a man beginning to recognize how thoroughly dispensable he actually was. "An interesting hypothesis," I acknowledged, accepting a cup of coffee from the caterer with a grateful nod, though not one supported by the evidence of the past 3 weeks. Daniel froze, coffee cup halfway to his lips. "What do you mean? The past 3 weeks?" I took a deliberate sip of my coffee, a special blend created exclusively for our home by a boutique roaster in New Orleans, another of my initiatives that Daniel had claimed as his own inspiration. "Since discovering your relationship with Vanessa and her pregnancy, I've been conducting something of an experiment," I explained, setting down my cup precisely on its saucer. "Testing your theory about your indispensability by gradually withdrawing my support while monitoring the results." Confusion mingled with dawning alarm on Daniel's face. "What are you talking about? Those briefing documents you rely on before major investor meetings? The financial analyses that inform your decisions? The strategic frameworks that guide your negotiations? I've been systematically reducing my contributions in those areas for 22 days now." I smiled slightly, watching comprehension dawn across his features. "And the results have been most illuminating. The Nashville zoning delay," Jack murmured, connecting dots rapidly. "The hiccup with the Miami renovation budget, the confusion with the Atlanta property tax assessment." Daniel's recent string of minor but uncharacteristic missteps, attributed by the board to distraction or overextension, suddenly appeared in an entirely different light. "Coincidental operational challenges," Daniel insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "Every business faces setbacks." "Indeed," I agreed pleasantly, though it's interesting how these particular setbacks align with specific areas where I withdrew my usual behind-the-scenes support. The symbolism of our surroundings took on new significance as the power dynamic shifted before everyone's eyes. The formal dining room with its traditional furniture and elegant appointments had always represented Daniel's self-conception: established, impressive, commanding. But the custom details I had selected over the years, the wall color, the artwork, the artisanal craftsmanship incorporated throughout, told a different story. One of subtle influence, of precision, of attention to elements Daniel had never even noticed. As Daniel's world unraveled thread by carefully pulled thread, I maintained the same poised demeanor I'd perfected over years of high-stakes client negotiations conducted from the shadows. Years of watching potential partners and competitors underestimate me because of my gender, my role as the wife, or my deliberately understated presence had taught me the power of composure. While men like Daniel expended energy on dramatic displays of dominance, I had learned to conserve mine for strategic deployment. "This is preposterous," Daniel declared, pushing back from the table with enough force to rattle the crystal. A few coincidental business challenges don't prove anything except that we're operating in volatile markets. Of course, I agreed mildly, taking another sip of coffee, though it's interesting that these coincidental challenges all occurred in areas where you previously relied on my analysis without acknowledgement. Across the table, Zach tilted, his head slightly, a gesture he'd inherited from me, indicating recognition of a pattern. "The Atlanta property tax assessment," he said slowly. "That was the same issue you helped me understand for my economics project last semester. The stepped depreciation structure." Daniel shot him a warning glance, but it was too late. My son had identified yet another instance where my expertise had been essential to the company's operations. "Your mother occasionally consults on specific issues," Daniel conceded reluctantly. "But the strategic direction and executive decisions have always been mine." "Have they?" I asked, setting down my coffee cup with precisely controlled movement. "Or have you simply been the public face presenting strategies I developed and decisions I engineered?" The twins exchanged another of their silent communications. A raised eyebrow from Emily met with a slight nod from Zach. In that wordless exchange, I recognized their reassessment of years of family dynamics through this new lens of understanding. "You've grown remarkably bold in your accusations tonight," Daniel observed, attempting to regain his footing through condescension. "I wonder if it's the emotional distress of our situation clouding your judgment. The familiar tactic, attributing my competence to emotion rather than intelligence, might have worked in the past. Tonight, it merely confirmed how little he had ever truly seen me." "On the contrary," I replied, my voice as level as my gaze, "my judgment has never been clearer. Emotional reactions would have served neither my interests nor the company's when I discovered your affair 3 weeks ago." Vanessa flinched slightly beside me, her discomfort at being caught between warring spouses evident in her posture. What she didn't yet understand was that this confrontation had moved far beyond the personal betrayal of infidelity to something much more significant: the systematic dismantling of a corporate fiction that had presented Daniel Mitchell as a business visionary. "If you knew 3 weeks ago," Vanessa ventured hesitantly, "why didn't you say anything then?" It was the first direct question she had asked me, and I appreciated both her courage in asking it and the strategic opportunity it provided for my narrative. "An excellent question," I acknowledged with a slight nod in her direction. "The answer demonstrates precisely what Daniel has never understood about effective business leadership." I turned my attention back to Daniel, whose expression had hardened into defensive hostility. "When I received the surveillance photos of you entering Dr. Morgan's obstetrics practice with Vanessa, I had 2 options: react emotionally or respond strategically. The former might have provided momentary satisfaction, but the latter offered something far more valuable: time to secure my position. The calculated revelation that I had photographic evidence of their affair before either of them realized they were being monitored sent another ripple of tension through the room. Daniel's jaw tightened further, while Vanessa's hand moved protectively to her stomach again, a gesture I now recognized as her default response to stress. "You had us followed?" Daniel demanded, outrage temporarily overriding his growing awareness of his precarious position. "I had the company's key staff monitored after identifying suspicious patterns in certain expenditures," I corrected smoothly. "A standard corporate due diligence measure, particularly when those patterns suggested misuse of company resources." The professional framing of what might otherwise be seen as personal surveillance shifted the narrative once again. From jealous wife to responsible corporate steward, from emotional reaction to fiduciary obligation. "You've been planning this ambush for weeks," Daniel accused, attempting to regain moral high ground. "I've been methodically documenting and preparing for contingencies," I countered, "a practice you often praised in business contexts." but apparently find objectionable when applied to our marriage. My mother watched this exchange with the experienced eye of someone who had witnessed decades of corporate maneuvering. "Rebecca has always had remarkable composure under pressure," she observed, directing her comment ostensibly to my father, but ensuring it carried to the entire table. "I've always thought it was her greatest strength as a leader." The deliberate use of leader, rather than supporter or advisor, was not lost on anyone present. My mother had publicly aligned herself with my perspective on my role within the Serenity Springs organization, a significant endorsement from the family matriarch. "Mother," Daniel began, his tone caught between deference and exasperation, "this isn't about Rebecca's temperament. It's about an apparent attempt to undermine my authority and destabilize the company through legal technicalities and creative interpretation of decades-old documents." "Is that how you see it?" I asked, genuine curiosity in my voice. Even now, facing incontrovertible evidence of his vulnerability, Daniel instinctively framed himself as the victim of external forces rather than the architect of his own predicament. "How else should I see it?" he demanded. "My wife of 18, years secretly meeting with our banking partners, withholding critical corporate support, and orchestrating what amounts to a hostile takeover of my company." "Our company," I corrected gently. "And technically, I can't orchestrate a hostile takeover of something I already legally control." The distinction hung in the air between us, crystallizing the fundamental reality Daniel was still struggling to accept. The empire he had built, his identity around, had never been solely his to command. Throughout this exchange, I maintained the same composed exterior I had presented since the beginning of the evening. Back straight, shoulders relaxed, hands steady, voice modulated. My burgundy dress, selected specifically for this confrontation, remained unwrinkled despite the hours of tension. The vintage pearl earrings that had been my grandmother's caught the light as I tilted my head slightly, waiting for Daniel's next attempt to reestablish control. "The legal reality of your financial stake doesn't change the operational reality of the company," he finally declared, attempting to pivot to practical considerations. "I am the CEO, recognized by our partners, our investors, and the market. Any attempt to disrupt that leadership would create chaos that would damage all our interests." It was a calculated appeal to mutual self-interest, another tactic I had seen him employ in countless business negotiations when his preferred position became untenable. "A valid concern," I acknowledged, respecting the strategic maneuver even as I prepared to counter it. "Which is why I've spent the past 3 weeks meeting with our key stakeholders to ensure continuity during the transition." Daniel went perfectly still, his expression frozen somewhere between disbelief and dawning comprehension. "What transition?" "The leadership transition plan approved by the board's executive committee last week," I replied, removing another document from my portfolio, a comprehensive succession strategy that addressed all operational concerns while ensuring minimal market disruption. "The executive committee never met last week," he objected, though uncertainty had crept into his voice. "They met at the Four Seasons in the private dining room," I informed him calmly. Patty Chen attended as counsel of record, along with representatives from our 3 largest investor groups. The meeting had been deliberately scheduled during Daniel's golf weekend in Hilton Head, one of many strategic decisions I had made in preparing for this confrontation. Each element had been carefully orchestrated to ensure maximum effectiveness with minimal drama, an approach to conflict resolution I had practiced throughout my career, but never before applied so comprehensively to my marriage. "That's impossible," Daniel insisted, though his voice had lost its earlier certainty. "Bob would have informed me." CFO Robert Henderson had been Daniel's closest ally in the company, a friendship that extended back to their college days. The implication that Bob had participated in this meeting without alerting Daniel represented another seismic shift in his understanding of where loyalties truly lay. Bob has been cooperating with the financial review for the past 4 weeks, I replied. He's been quite transparent about the irregularities he helped conceal at your direction. His immunity agreement with the board is contingent on his continued cooperation. The systematic dismantling of Daniel's support structure was now becoming evident. Each ally he might have counted on had been neutralized through strategic outreach, careful documentation, or legal agreements that prioritized institutional interests over personal loyalty. Vanessa looked increasingly alarmed as she processed the implications of these revelations. "Daniel," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, "what does this mean?" He ignored her question, his attention fixed entirely on me. "You've orchestrated a corporate coup while pretending to be my supportive wife," he stated flatly, anger and disbelief mingling in his expression. "I've secured the company's future while you were focused on securing your midlife crisis," I corrected, my composed exterior never wavering despite the emotional weight of the moment. "The distinction is important from both a governance and ethical perspective." "This is insanity," he declared, looking around the table for support and finding none. Even Jack, who had traditionally deferred to his older brother in all business matters, maintained a careful neutrality that spoke volumes about his assessment of the shifting power dynamics. "On the contrary," my mother interjected, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had guided our family through previous crises. "It appears to be extremely well-reasoned and meticulously executed, qualities the Serenity Springs organization has always valued in its leadership." The subtle emphasis on "always" served as a pointed reminder that my mother had been an early investor in the company, with a perspective on its governance that extended back to its founding principles, qualities Daniel had increasingly abandoned in favor of impulsive decisions and short-term gains. "The board won't stand for this," Daniel insisted, though his tone suggested he was attempting to convince himself rather than the table. "They understand my vision for the company's future." "They understand the company's performance metrics and legal realities," I countered, both of which now clearly favor the transition plan I've proposed. Throughout this exchange, I maintained perfect composure, no raised voice, no dramatic gestures, no visible anger despite the personal betrayal that had catalyzed these events. My breathing remained steady, my hands relaxed, my expression attentive but not combative. This controlled exterior was not merely a personal discipline, but a strategic choice. I had observed throughout my career how emotional displays by women in business settings were invariably used to discredit their professional judgment, while similar displays from men were often characterized as passion or intensity. By maintaining absolute composure while systematically dismantling Daniel's position, I was denying him the opportunity to dismiss my actions as emotional retaliation. "Dad's face is getting really red," Zach observed with the clinical detachment of someone raised to analyze rather than react. "Perhaps we should pause this discussion." "An excellent suggestion," I agreed, signaling to the caterer hovering discreetly along the perimeter of the dining room. I believe traditional Easter celebrations call for petit fours and cordials at this point in the evening. The deliberate return to established ritual served multiple purposes, reinforcing my command of family traditions, providing a momentary de-escalation of tensions, and demonstrating to everyone present that I remained in perfect control of both the situation and myself, despite the increasingly dramatic revelations. The caterer approached with a silver tray bearing crystal decanters of aged port and limoncello, the standard Mitchell after-dinner selection that I had codified in our entertaining routine years earlier. "Would you prefer the tawny port or limoncello this evening, Mrs. Mitchell?" he inquired, maintaining the flawless professionalism we expected from our service staff. "The limoncello would be appropriate for the occasion," I replied with a slight smile. It was Thomas's preference for significant family moments. The reference to my father and his implied endorsement of my actions was another calculated element in the psychological architecture of the evening. Daniel had spent years cultivating my father's approval, a relationship that had created vulnerabilities I now exploited with surgical precision. As the pale yellow liqueur was poured into chilled crystal glasses, another design element I had selected for our home entertaining, I maintained the same poised exterior that had served me throughout the evening, never revealing the years of accumulated grievances and strategic patience that had led to this moment of reckoning. As the limoncello was distributed around the table, with Daniel noticeably abstaining, his earlier bourbon confidence replaced by wary sobriety, I reached once more into my portfolio. The leather case had become something of a Pandora's box throughout the evening, each withdrawal revealing another layer of Daniel's vulnerability and my methodical preparation. "Before we move forward with discussing the transition details," I said, my voice carrying that blend of warmth and authority I'd perfected over years of steering executive committees without appearing to lead them, "perhaps we should address what initially drew my attention 3 weeks ago." Daniel's hand tightened around his water glass. "This isn't an appropriate venue for discussing operational matters," he objected, attempting to reestablish professional boundaries now that they served his interests. "On the contrary," I countered gently, "given that these matters involve personal expenses charged to corporate accounts, including several related to your relationship with Vanessa, I believe this hybrid personal-professional setting is uniquely appropriate." The color that had drained from Daniel's face earlier now returned in a rush of angry crimson. Beside him, Vanessa shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncertain whether she was being implicated in financial impropriety. "I have no idea what you're talking about," Daniel stated flatly, though the tension in his jaw suggested otherwise. I withdrew a slim folder bound with the distinctive blue ribbon used by Serenity Springs' financial department for confidential reports. "The Sedona expenditures from last January would be a logical starting point," I suggested, opening the folder to reveal a detailed expense report. Specifically, the suite at L'Auberge charged to the executive retreat budget, despite no executive retreat being conducted during that stay. Vanessa's sharp intake of breath was barely audible but unmistakable. January in Sedona had clearly been significant in their relationship timeline. "Business development meetings don't always follow conventional formats," Daniel replied, his corporate doublespeak reflexive even as its ineffectiveness became apparent. "L'Auberge provides an appropriate setting for high-level strategic discussions." "Indeed it does," I agreed pleasantly. "Though it's curious that no such discussions appear in your calendar for those dates, while Vanessa's personal Instagram showed her enjoying the resort's spa facilities that same weekend. A remarkable coincidence." The twins exchanged another of their silent communications, raised eyebrows and a slight tilt of the head that conveyed their synchronized processing of this revelation. They had been raised in the digital age and understood immediately the digital trail their father had failed to consider. "You've been monitoring my social media?" Vanessa asked, disbelief momentarily overriding her discomfort. "Not actively," I assured her, "but when certain financial anomalies appeared in the executive expenditures, a basic digital verification process was the logical next step. Corporate due diligence requires following evidence where it leads." The framing was deliberate, positioning my investigation as professional rather than personal, as responsible corporate governance rather than jealous surveillance. This distinction was crucial not just for my narrative, but for the legal protections it afforded my actions. "Financial anomalies can be explained through proper accounting reviews," Daniel insisted, attempting to regain control of the narrative. "If there were legitimate concerns, they should have been raised through appropriate channels." "They were," I confirmed, turning to the next page in the report, with Bob Henderson on February 15th, who assured me they would be addressed internally. When no such action materialized by March 1st, I escalated to Patty Chen in her capacity as corporate counsel. The precise dates weren't arbitrary. They established a timeline of appropriate corporate procedure, of reasonable attempts to resolve matters through conventional channels before taking more dramatic steps. This chronology would be crucial. for the board's comfort with the transition plan, and for any subsequent legal challenges Daniel might attempt. "Bob should have informed me of any serious concerns," Daniel countered, though his confident tone had diminished noticeably. "He did indicate he would discuss the matter with you," I acknowledged, though his subsequent cooperation with the broader financial review suggests that discussion may not have been productive. I turned to the next page in the report, where a series of highlighted entries detailed a pattern of personal expenses disguised as business expenditures. "The Van Cleef and Arpels purchase on Peachtree Street last Christmas is particularly interesting," I noted, keeping my tone conversational despite the personal implications of the entry. "Charged to client appreciation, but delivered to Vanessa's apartment according to the courier receipt." Vanessa's hand moved reflexively to the diamond pendant at her throat, the same pendant I had noticed when she arrived this evening, though I had recognized its origin long before she entered our home. "Corporate entertainment and relationship. Management take many forms in our industry," Daniel replied, falling back on the practiced vagueness that had served him in board meetings when specific questions arose about expense allocations. In the silence that followed my revelations, Daniel stared at the prenuptial agreement lying open before him, the reality of his situation finally dawning. The highlighted infidelity clause transferred complete ownership of Serenity Springs to me upon documented proof I had methodically gathered over 3 weeks. "You can't do this," he whispered, voice barely audible. "It's already done," I replied calmly. "The ownership transfer was filed this morning. The board has been notified." Vanessa's hand trembled as she touched her stomach protectively. "What about—" "Your child will be provided for," I assured her. "That responsibility transcends our current circumstances." Emily and Zach exchanged glances of reluctant admiration at my thoroughness. My mother nodded slightly, the attorney, in her appreciating strategic precision, the mother acknowledging painful necessity. "Your personal effects will be packed by tomorrow," I continued, my voice steady. "The company car should be returned by Wednesday. Naturally, you'll retain your personal investment portfolio." Daniel's face cycled through shock, anger, and, finally, grudging respect. "You outsmarted me completely." "No, Daniel. I simply paid attention to details you deemed beneath you." As the family dispersed in stunned silence, Vanessa following Daniel like a shadow, my father briefly squeezed my shoulder. "You'll be all right?" "Better than all right," I replied. 3 weeks later, Serenity Springs announced record quarterly earnings under new leadership. The press praised the seamless transition following Daniel's decision to pursue personal interests. Meanwhile, I sat in what was once his office, reviewing expansion plans for our Charleston location. The prenuptial agreement framed on my wall served as a reminder. Power doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it waits patiently, hidden in plain sight, for exactly the right moment to emerge. 1 year later, I sat in the executive office of Serenity Springs headquarters, reviewing the quarterly reports with a satisfied smile. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Atlanta's skyline, the late afternoon sun bathing the city in golden light. On my desk sat a Crystal Award, Businesswoman of the Year from the Southeast Wellness Association, recognition that had been a long time coming. The knock on my door was gentle but confident. "Come in," I called, setting aside the financial projections that showed another record-breaking quarter under my leadership. Emily entered, looking more polished and professional than ever in a tailored pantsuit, her internship with our marketing department clearly suiting her. At 20, she'd blossomed into a young woman with remarkable business acumen, something that had always been there but now had room to flourish. "The Charleston property photographs just arrived," she announced, placing a portfolio on my desk. "The renovation is even more impressive than the rendering suggested." I opened the leather-bound portfolio to find stunning images of our newest flagship property, the wellness retreat I had envisioned and finally brought to life after years of Daniel dismissing the concept as too ambitious. The integration of historic Charleston architecture with modern wellness facilities created something truly unique in the industry. Your design vision was spot on, Emily remarked, pointing to the central courtyard with its reflecting pool and indigenous plantings. The early booking numbers are already exceeding projections by 30%. Christopher Jensen deserves most of the credit, I replied, though I couldn't help feeling pride in seeing my original concept executed so beautifully. His architectural talent brought everything together. He told me it was your initial sketch that inspired the whole approach, Emily countered with a knowing smile. You're still doing it, you know, deflecting credit that rightfully belongs to you. Her observation caught me off guard. Old habits died hard, even after a year of occupying the position I had earned. A fair point, I acknowledged. Some patterns take time to unlearn. Speaking of patterns, Emily said, her tone shifting slightly. Dad called this morning about the Nashville property review. He and Vanessa want to present their expansion proposal at next month's board meeting. I nodded, appreciating her directness. The past year had been one of careful recalibration, not just for the company but for our family as well. Daniel had surprised everyone by embracing his role as non-executive chairman with unexpected professionalism. Whether motivated by pragmatism, pride, or genuine growth, he had fulfilled his responsibilities with diligence and even occasional insight. "How is little Sophie?" I asked, referring to Daniel and Vanessa's daughter, now 7 months old. "Adorable and determined," Emily replied with genuine warmth. "She already has Dad wrapped around her finger. It's actually nice to see that side of him." The complex emotions in her voice mirrored my own feelings about this unexpected new branch of our family tree. The baby had become a catalyst for healing rather than division, somehow helping to transform what could have been irreparable harm into something approaching a healthy extended family dynamic. "And Vanessa?" I inquired, genuinely interested in her welfare. "Thriving in the Nashville role, actually. Her marketing initiatives for the local wellness community have generated significant goodwill." Emily hesitated before adding, "She asked if you might consider her proposal for the teen wellness program independently of Dad's presentation." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued by this development. "Send me her materials. If the concept has merit, it deserves fair consideration regardless of personal history." Emily nodded, clearly pleased with my response. "I told her you'd say that. Your ability to separate business decisions from personal feelings is something we've all come to appreciate." My phone chimed with a calendar notification. My monthly call with Hiroshi Nakamura about the Tokyo expansion was due to begin in 5 minutes. "I need to prepare for the Nakamura call," I said, rising from my desk. "Would you join me? His perspective on multi-generational wellness approaches might be valuable for your market research project." Emily's eyes widened at the opportunity to participate in a call with one of the industry's most respected figures, an opportunity Daniel would never have extended to her. "Absolutely. Should I take notes or just observe?" "Both," I replied. "And don't hesitate to contribute if you have insights. Nakamura-san appreciates fresh perspectives, especially from the next generation of leadership." As Emily took a seat at the conference table, arranging her tablet and notebook with meticulous precision, I was struck by how much she reminded me of myself at her age: eager, observant, strategic. The difference was that she wouldn't have to spend decades in the shadows before her contributions were recognized. That, perhaps more than anything else, was the true victory of the past year. The familiar tone of an incoming video call drew my attention to the large screen on the wall. As I prepared to greet our Japanese partner, I reflected briefly on how thoroughly the company had transformed under my leadership. 6 new properties under development, client satisfaction scores at their highest in company history, employee retention strengthened through improved benefits and transparent management, all accomplished while maintaining the wellness philosophy. That had been the heart of Serenity Springs from the beginning. Later that evening, I stood in the kitchen of my new penthouse, enjoying the simple pleasure of preparing dinner for Zach, who was home from college for the weekend. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a different view of Atlanta than my office, more intimate somehow, with neighborhood lights twinkling against the darkening sky. I had moved here 3 months after the Easter dinner revelation, needing space that wasn't saturated with memories. "Need any help?" Zach asked, leaning against the counter as I chopped vegetables for a stir-fry. "You could open that Pinot Noir," I suggested, nodding toward the wine rack, the California one from that vineyard we visited last summer. As he skillfully uncorked the bottle, I observed how much he'd matured in just a year. His first year at Georgia Tech had given him confidence and purpose, his natural analytical abilities finding perfect expression in computer science and business courses. "I ran into Morgan Delaney at the tech conference yesterday," he mentioned, casually as he poured the wine. I paused my chopping momentarily, surprised by the reference to Daniel's former paramour. The interior designer? What was she doing at a technology conference? "Presenting on digital visualization tools for design projects," Zach explained. "She's quite accomplished professionally, despite her questionable personal choices. She asked about you, actually." "About me?" I couldn't hide my surprise. She said, and I quote, "Your mother is the most formidable woman I've ever encountered. I've learned valuable lessons from her strategy, though I wish the circumstances had been different." Zach handed me a glass of wine. Apparently, being outmaneuvered by you gave her some perspective. She's teaching at SCAD now, focusing on ethical business practices in design. I laughed softly, appreciating the irony. Life takes unexpected turns. "Speaking of unexpected," Zach continued, his tone shifting to something more serious, "I've been thinking about my role at Serenity Springs after graduation." "You know there's no pressure," I assured him. "The company will always be there, if and when you're interested, but your path should be your own." "That's just it," he replied, leaning forward with enthusiasm. "I've been developing a wellness technology platform for my senior project, a way to integrate digital experiences with the physical wellness environments Serenity Springs creates. I'd like to pitch it to the Innovation Committee next month." The pride that swelled in my chest had nothing to do with the company and everything to do with the confident, ethical young man before me. "They'd be fools not to listen," I said. "Just be prepared for rigorous questions from the committee chair." "You mean from you?" He grinned. "Especially from me," I confirmed with a smile. "No special treatment, remember?" I wouldn't want it any other way. He raised his glass in a small toast, to earning your place rather than expecting it. The sentiment resonated deeply as we clinked glasses. That philosophy had guided my approach to rebuilding Serenity Springs, creating a culture where contribution and integrity mattered more than titles or relationships. The company's renaissance under this principle had vindicated my belief that sustainable success required both. My phone buzzed with an incoming text from my mother. "Dinner tomorrow? Have news about the foundation expansion." Margaret Wilson had channeled her legal expertise into expanding the Serenity Foundation's work, providing wellness services to underserved communities, work that had given her renewed purpose after partial retirement. As I replied, confirming our dinner plans, I reflected on how the family had reconfigured itself around truth rather than comfortable fictions. My parents had shown remarkable resilience and wisdom throughout the transition, offering support without judgment and perspective without interference. Their relationship with Daniel remained civil but distant, respectful coexistence rather than forced intimacy. The twins had perhaps shown the most impressive growth, navigating the complex waters of loyalty and truth with remarkable maturity. They maintained relationships with both parents without being drawn into taking sides, establishing healthy boundaries while remaining connected to both family branches. After dinner, Zach retreated to the guest room to work on his project, and I found myself drawn to the small home office I'd created in the penthouse. Unlike my previous home office, with its deliberately understated design that minimized its importance. This space boldly reflected my aesthetic and professional identity, modern yet warm, efficient yet inviting. On the wall hung a simple framed document, not the prenuptial agreement itself, which remained securely filed with the company's legal team, but the letter my mother had written to accompany it 18 years ago. Her elegant handwriting had faded slightly with time, but the words remained clear. Rebecca, you see this document as pessimistic legal protection, but I see it as the foundation of true partnership. True strength isn't in dominating others, but in knowing your worth so completely that you can afford to be generous. May you never need these protections, but should that day come, remember that reclaiming your power isn't about vengeance but restoration, with love and confidence in your judgment, Mom. Her wisdom had proven prophetic. The prenuptial agreement had ultimately served not as a weapon of destruction, but as a tool of restoration, realigning the company and our family with truth rather than convenience. The genuine growth that had emerged from that painful Easter confrontation, for the company, for my children, and yes, even for Daniel, validated the approach I had taken. I turned from the framed letter to my computer, opening the file containing my upcoming keynote speech for the Women in Wellness Leadership Conference. The title slide read, Invisible to Indispensable, Reclaiming Your Place at the Table You Built. The speech would share my journey without naming names or airing private grievances, focusing instead on the strategic lessons applicable to so many women who found themselves in similar situations. The message wasn't about bitterness or revenge, but about recognizing worth, documenting contribution, and strategically reclaiming deserved position. As I refined the presentation, adding notes about preparation, documentation, and the power of composed strategic action over emotional reaction, I realized how completely I had internalized these lessons. The Rebecca who had allowed her contributions to be overshadowed for 18 years was gone, replaced by a leader who understood that her greatest strength had always been the patient, methodical competence that others had underestimated. The most powerful form of vindication wasn't in destroying what had been built, but in revealing who had built it all along, and then taking that foundation and transforming it into something even stronger. Serenity Springs under my leadership wasn't just surviving. It was thriving in ways Daniel's approach never could have achieved, expanding thoughtfully while maintaining the core wellness philosophy that had always been its heart. Perhaps that was the most perfect revenge of all, not the satisfaction of seeing Daniel diminished, but the joy of seeing my own vision finally, fully realized. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.